If you want to plant a delusion in a perfectly healthy mind, the good news is that psychiatry has already written the recipe for you. The bad news is that once you understand the recipe, you will start recognizing it everywhere, in families, in cults, in political movements, and occasionally in your own practice. Let's begin where every respectable diagnosis begins, the DSM-5. Shared psychotic disorder, the old folie à deux, was demoted in the DSM-5 into the category of other specified schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders, with the specifier delusional symptoms in the partner of an individual with delusional disorder. The change in the nomenclature did not change the clinical reality. You still need a primary patient with an entrenched delusion, a second person in close and prolonged contact, and a belief system that migrates from one mind into the other as if it was a virus. The recipient has no psychotic illness before the encounter and frequently recovers when the encounter ends. This last detail, recovering when the encounter ends, is the most important one. Let us name our two protagonists properly. The clinical literature calls them the inducer or proband and the recipient or adherent. I prefer to think of them as the carrier and the host, because the language of infection maps onto this condition with very high precision. The carrier is almost always the dominant personality in the dyad, intelligent, verbally fluent, often charismatic, and suffering from a chronic psychotic illness, most commonly schizophrenia or persistent delusional disorder. The delusion is not a passing thought for them. It is the organizing principle of their inner world, defended with the energy most of the people reserve for their children. They experience themselves as the only persons in the room who see the reality clearly. The host is a very different creature. The host has no primary psychosis. What the host has is vulnerability. The literature consistently describes the recipient as passive, suggestible, emotionally dependent, and deferential to authority. Often younger, often female, in the historical case series, often in a subordinate position within the family structure. And this is the part we tend to whisper about at conferences, frequently possessing limited formal education and underdeveloped critical thinking skills. The older case series from Gralnik, The Worst, and Todd, and more recent reviews in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry all converge on the same uncomfortable finding. Low educational attainment and cognitive limitations are facilitators, not incidental features. A mind with fewer competing frameworks has fewer antibodies against a foreign idea. Now add the third ingredient, which is in many ways the most important one, social isolation. Shared delusions almost never develop in well-connected, socially embedded individuals. They develop in closed systems. An elderly couple who stopped seeing friends a decade ago. Two sisters living in the same house since childhood. A small, insular family that regards the outside world with suspicion. A cult compound. A marriage in which one partner has systematically severed the other's ties to the outside world. Without external reality testing, without friends, colleagues, newspapers, neighbors, a second opinion of any kind, the carrier's delusion become the only available narrative. The echo chamber is not a metaphor here, it is the clinical substrate. And now I want to propose an analogy that I think captures what is actually happening in a shared delusional disorder better than any of the existing language. We usually think of a delusion as something a sick mind generates from within, the way a tumor arises from a single cell in a single tissue going rogue. That model works beautifully for schizophrenia. It does not work for the recipient in folie à deux. The recipient's mind did not generate the delusion. The delusion arrived from outside, already assembled, and began infiltrating previously healthy belief structures the way a malignant cell infiltrates previously healthy tissue. This is not ordinary cancer. This is something much rarer and much stranger. Transmissible cancer. a category that mercifully does not exist in humans, but it does exist in two well-documented animal species. In domestic dogs, there is a canine transmissible venereal tumor, also called Sticker's sarcoma, in which living tumor cells detach from one dog and implant themselves in another through direct contact, then proliferate in the new host. In Tasmanian devils, there is a devil facial tumor disease, or DFTD, in which facial tumors transmit from animal to animal through biting during fights and feeding. DFTD is not a minor veterinary curiosity. It has driven the Tasmanian devil to the brink of extinction, reshaped the species' behavior, and forced evolutionary changes in the survivors. One animal, one bite, and a foreign cell line takes root and kills. Shared delusional disorder is the psychiatric analog. The carrier plants the seed takes hold in the host belief system. It begins to infiltrate surrounding healthy beliefs about reality, displacing them, reorganizing them until the host cannot distinguish the imported delusion from their own cognition. Same architecture like in the inducer, but a different substrate, the mind of the healthy inductee. Let me put the clinical differences on a grid because the contrast is the whole point. The carrier has a chronic primary psychosis. The host does not. The carrier's personality is dominant, intelligent, persuasive. The host's personality is passive, suggestible, dependent. Both live inside a closed social system with minimal outside contact, which is what allows transmission in the first place. And the cleanest diagnostic test, the one that separates this condition from almost every other psychotic presentation, is the response to separation. Separate the two, and the carrier's delusion persists unchanged because it is endogenous. Separate the two, and the host's delusion typically resolves because it was never theirs to begin with. The tumor, once the carrier is removed, stops receiving its blood supply. This is where we get lucky as a species. The Tasmanian devil has no cure for DFTD. Dogs with sticker sarcoma fortunately respond to a short course of vincristine. Roughly 4 to 6 weeks of chemotherapy cure rates above 90%. That is why, incidentally, no one has built a vaccine for it. The cure is cheap and effective, so the economic pressure to prevent the disease evaporates. Humans with shared delusional disorder need no vincristine at all. The treatment is separation. Geography and time do the work. Remove the host from the carrier, provide an external informational environment, and the imported delusions wither. But prevention in human is still the better strategy, and prevention is where education and critical thinking enter the clinical picture with the weight of a public health intervention. A mind well stocked with competing frameworks, trained to ask for evidence, accustomed to comparing sources, is a mind with a functioning immune system. Foreign ideas arrive and get inspected at the gate. Weak ones get rejected. Strong ones get integrated with the appropriate skepticism. A mind that has never been trained to do any of this is an immunocompromised mind. The carrier's delusion walks in unchallenged and sets up residence. Isolation, low education, and absent critical thinking are three risk factors that matter, and all three are modifiable. That is an extraordinary fact, and we do not repeat it often enough. Now for the fourth idea, and the one that gets me into the most trouble at dinner parties. DSM-5 has no category for mass delusional belief. Folie à deux covers two people. Folie à trois, à famille, à plusieurs. The old French literature has names for small groups, but when the number grows into thousands or the millions, the DSM goes silent. Why? Because psychiatry has a long-standing convention. A belief that is culturally sanctioned is, by definition, not a delusion. The moment enough people believe something, it stops being pathology and becomes culture. That is a useful rule for keeping psychiatrists out of theology departments. It is a terrible rule for describing what actually happens in history. Religious belief systems sit in the protected zone, so arguably Do so some political ones. Science is the interesting exception, not because scientific beliefs are never wrong, they often are, but because science contains an internal self-cleansing mechanism. When evidence contradicts a claim, the claim is supposed to be discarded. Sometimes it even gets discarded before a replacement exists, if it fails to predict or fails to fit. The cleansing mechanism is the difference between a knowledge system and a delusional system, and it has nothing to do with how many people hold the belief. The historical record of mass delusions, of belief systems that meet every clinical criteria for delusional thinking except the head count, is long and grim. Stalin's Great Terror in the 1930s rested on the widely accepted conviction that the Soviet Union was riddled with an invisible network of saboteurs, wreckers, and fifth columnists working for foreign powers. The belief was unfalsifiable, self-reinforcing, and catastrophically consequential. Conservative estimates put the death toll at 950,000 to 1.2 million people executed or dead in the camps. In 1844, the Baptist preacher William Miller convinced tens of thousands of Americans that Jesus Christ would return on October 22nd of that year. When he did not, the movement collapsed into what historians politely called the Great Disappointment, and less politely, a textbook demonstration of shared, unfalsifiable belief. In Singapore in 1967 and in subsequent African outbreaks, thousands of men simultaneously became convinced their genitalia were retracting into their bodies and that retraction would kill them. The condition has a name, Coro, and no organic cause. It spreads by rumor and proximity, exactly the way a shared delusion is supposed to spread. The modern cult literature provides cleaner case studies. The People's Temple under Jim Jones ended in Jonestown with 918 dead, the vast majority by willing or forced cyanide poisoning, some of them by gunshot. Heaven's Gate ended with 39 members dead by orderly, voluntary suicide, convinced that they were boarding some kind of spacecraft trailing in the Hale-Bopp comet. In both cases, the carriers were charismatic men with fixed delusional systems. In both cases, the hosts were recruited, isolated from outside contact, stripped of competing information sources, and gradually absorbed into a belief structure they would never have entertained on their own. The clinical architecture is identical to folie à deux, only the scale is different. And scale is why I'm willing to call this pathology even when the DSM will not. A delusion is maladaptive by definition. It degrades the person's ability to survive, to thrive, to reproduce, to raise viable children, to navigate reality. In folie à deux, the consequences are usually tragic but local. In mass delusion, the consequences are historical. Jonestown, 918 dead. Heaven's Gate, 39 dead. Stalin's terror, over 1 million dead. And if you accept, as I do, that the ideology of Nazi Germany meets every operational criteria for shared, unfalsifiable belief system that infiltrated healthy minds through isolation, propaganda, and the systemic destruction of critical thinking, then the death toll of that single mass delusion sits somewhere between 70 and 85 million people, roughly 3% of the global population at the time, 3% of humanity. At that scale, the question of whether to call mass delusion a disorder stops being an academic one. Any intervention that reduces the probability of this happening again is, by any reasonable calculation, cost-effective, and the intervention is not expensive. It is not pharmacological. It does not require a new class of drugs or a new billing code. It requires three things: access to diverse information, sustained contact with people outside the closed system, and the cognitive habits we call critical thinking. Those are the vaccine. Those are the vincristine. Those are the entire treatment plan, and we already know how to deliver them. We call it education, and we call it open society, and we have known for at least 200 years that both of them work. So, how do you induce a delusion in a healthy person? You find someone suggestible. You isolate them from everyone who might disagree with you. You deprive them of competing information. You make sure that their critical thinking was never properly trained in the first place. And then you speak with conviction repeatedly for long enough that your reality becomes their only available reality. That is a recipe. It works on one person, on two, on 918, 80 million. The dose changes, the mechanism does not. Our job as clinicians is to recognize it early, to separate the host from the carrier when we can, and to advocate loudly and without professional modesty we usually wear for the social conditions that make the whole transmission impossible in the first place. Because the only delusion I am genuinely afraid of is the one we stopped calling a delusion because too many people already believed it.